Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to be able to share energy with you and just hold space together. So thank you, for real. I'm Farah, the panel producer. And I don't know if you know, but this is the 12th annual BlackStar Film Festival. Okay? This panel is such a joy because we've featured basically all of these folks' work over the years, and they're such a tender, intimate quality to animation, and it's really beautiful to kind of have everybody gathered here again today. So yeah, thank you for participating, and of course we would like to thank our individual donors, our funders, our network, our vast network of community and producing partners. Don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms at BlackStar Fest and use the hashtags BSFF23 and BlackStar on Broad. The runtime for this panel is 60 minutes, including audience Q&A. So for the last 10 or 15 minutes, we will be taking questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Carrie Hawks. Carrie Hawks confronts self-imposed and external assumptions about identity in order to promote healing, particularly in relation to Blackness, gender, and queer sexuality. They work in animation, drawing, collage, sculpture, and performance, often incorporating humor. Their film, Black Enuf, that's E-N-U-F, was nominated for a New York Emmy, screened at over 40 festivals, including BlackStar, and made its way to broadcast debut on World Channel. They are an assistant professor at Parsons, the New School.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. We will have time for questions at the end. And first I'm just gonna read some bios of our wonderful panelists. So right here, Iyabo Kwayana. Iyabo is an independent filmmaker whose career spans from serving as director/DP for fiction films to director, co-cinematographer of award-winning documentaries. Her work has been licensed by both the Criterion Channel and the World Channel PBS and has screened widely both domestically and internationally on the festival circuit. Iyabo currently teaches filmmaking at Dartmouth College. Charlotte Hong B. Her is a Chicago-based animation artist and filmmaker from Singapore. Their debut feature, Tropical Rain, Death-Scented Kiss, is a selection of the Chicago Industry Exchange Lab, organized by the Chicago International Film Festival. They are a co-founder of Total Blur Productions. On the far end, well, actually, I'll just go in order. Well, on the far end is Vashti Harrison. Vashti is the #1 New York best-selling author and illustrator of the acclaimed collection of children's books, Little Leaders, Little Dreamers, and Little Legends. Her artistic talents, through notable collaborations such as illustrating Andrea Beauty's enchanting I Love You Like Yellow, Matthew Cherry's heartwarming Hair Love, and Stephanie V.W. Lucianovic's Hello Star, among others. Vashti's dedication and talent have been recognized with prestigious accolades, including a Coretta Scott King Illustrator Award for Lupita Nyong'o's Sully, as well as 2 NAACP Image Awards for Outstanding Literary Work for Children. Vashti lives in Brooklyn, New York, and invites you to explore more of her work at vashtiharrison.com.
Lovely.
And we have Ayoka Chenzira. Ayo is an Emmy and NAACP-nominated television director and award-winning pioneer in the Black American independent cinema. She is one of the first African-American women to write, produce, and direct a 35mm feature film, Almost Rainbow, and an animated film, Hair Piece, which in 2018 was inducted in the National Film Registry at the Library of Congress. Her early films recently received 4K restorations by the Academy of Motion Pictures of Arts and Sciences, Film Archive, and the Film Foundation. In 2023, Bowie State University named its stop-motion animation studio in Ayoka's honor, and Black Women Animate and the Cartoon Network honored her in 2020 with the Cultural Innovator Award. Ayoka has directed television episodes of Queen Sugar, Trinkets, Greenleaf, Dynasty, Delilah, A League of Their Own, 4400, Octavia Butler's Kindred, and Beacon 23. So my first question for you all, I'm hoping you could answer in 1 to 2 sentences just to get us started. There's often a misconception that animation is strictly for children, and I'm curious when you first realized that it could be for a wider audience. Anyone can start.
So for me, I never thought animation was just for children. It's a genre that is about ideas. And my early introduction to animation was actually through the work of Eastern European animators, who are really at the forefront of a lot of very powerful animation. So I always saw it as a world of ideas and an incredible storytelling device.
And my entry point into animation, I'm not an animator, although I have animated one film by hand, 30 seconds. It was torturous. Was because I grew up in San Diego and they had an animation festival there when I was growing up at La Jolla Animation Festival. And that was actually my first introduction to film. Animation was my first introduction to film, and there were short films, and they were all so different, exciting, innovative, like different ways of approaching expression and storytelling. So I was really moved to and excited to reflect on that, like that aspect of the child quality of it, because I think for me, there is a misconception because there were so many themes and entry points into the human expression and human condition that came about through these shorts. So I would say, yeah, it is a huge misconception.
Charlotte or Vashti?
Yeah, I also really agree that animation is definitely not just for children. I think my entry point into it was always that I always loved to draw, and drawing was one of the easiest things that came to me and just felt as natural as breathing. Early on, realizing that I could combine that with storytelling. I was really influenced by the work of Prit Parn too, who is an incredible Eastern European animator, and used the medium to tell stories that were also really politically subversive and exciting. Yeah, if animation is for kids, then I don't want to grow up.
Well, I do make work for children, so, but before I started illustrating and writing children's books, I made experimental films, and my first introduction to actually making animation was through the lens of experimental animation and experimental filmmaking, and looking at video art from the early 2000s, and I think my education in art making came from this alternative lens that shaped how I approach all of my work, even though now I work in a very commercial space. So I think I've always known that animation is a tool, it's a medium for communicating, period. Communicating story, communicating anything. So I think in the same way that people assume that animation is just for children, I often get this expectation that writing children's books or illustrating children's books is easy, it's simple, but none of those things are true. So I appreciate all of the work that these wonderful artists create.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just curious, in the audience, how many people have animated? You may not identify as an animator, but have you animated? Okay. And how many people identify as an animator? Yeah, okay. Curious. Okay. So I was also curious about motivations as storytelling and why someone may choose to tell a story in animation rather than live action filmmaking. So if you want to talk about maybe that discussion for yourself, or also what freedoms does animation provide beyond live action filmmaking? Ayo, would you like to start?
So in 1984, I made a work, an animated work by hand called Hairpiece, a film for nappy-headed people. Wow, thank you. Lovely. And so I grew up in a beauty parlor. I have had everything done to my hair imaginable. And I noticed when I lived in Brooklyn in the 80s, I noticed that Black people in Bed-Stuy were walking down the street with shower caps on their heads. And I did not know what that was about. I did not get that memo. The reason that they were doing this is because the Jerry curl was becoming popular, and you activated the Jerry curl liquid by keeping heat in the head with a shower cap. So I'd go to the bank, I'd go in the subway, and there we were with these shower caps. And I felt some kind of way about it. And I wanted to talk about Black people and hair and the ritual of adornment versus looking in the mirror saying, I hate this. And so I was not interested in finger pointing. I didn't want you to identify with a specific person. I wanted it to be satirical and broader, and so animation was a way to kind of leapfrog in ways that I wouldn't be able to do, I don't think, successfully with live action. So as a vehicle of both satire and wanting to discuss some very complicated issues and also have a conversation with my community, animation served me very well for that particular piece.
Yeah, I love that piece, and anyway, I'm honored to be on this panel with you. But other people want to talk about the freedom that animation provides.
As someone that does live action, I think everyone works in both mediums, but I primarily work in live action. Animation is a tool that permits you to go cross dimensions anywhere that you want. What is that movie called?
Everything,
yeah.
Everywhere, all at once.
Yeah, it's just, before that movie, it was like one of the only ways of collapsing time, going in and out of spaces, going across dimensions. It's a beautiful metaphysical art form, and the interplay between your own subjectivity and the animator and the audience is all such a beautiful, luscious domain. So for the film that I collaborated with Charlotte on, it was a film about my brother, and at the time he had disappeared, and it was the right vehicle to conjure up like a prayer, to reconnect with him, because I don't think the conceits of reality through live action could have done that for me. So it was a way of me like getting rid of my left logical brain and sort of like listening more, and even more so because I was working with someone that was really driving the animation forward.
It's beautiful, thank you. There are many ways to be an animator, and just speaking to what I know, like with our film, I think that the really special thing about being trusted with this really personal story was that when a person's no longer in your life, the only way you can meet them again is, or talk to them or interact with them, is like in a dream, right? And I think animation has a very direct line to that subconscious aspect of ourselves when we're creating and thinking of images as artists. It's really, these, with live action, you have the vicissitudes of weather and time and people, and it's like with a whole team. And I've been fortunate to have the people who've guided me into filmmaking and become some of my closest collaborators be live action as well. I think animation really allows you to tap into that subconscious symbolic, which then becomes powerful for more than just the minds that created it.
Vashti, I would expand that also into illustration, if you wanted to speak on that, or animation.
I don't remember the question, but I was
Yeah.
thinking about their film and how lovely the movement and the like line boil, the quality of how the characters and set pieces move around the frame. And I feel like something that, a misconception about art making, a misconception about drawing is that like people who can draw can just do it. It must be easy for you, but it is hard work, and there's this intimacy that drawing and the type of animation that you've created that requires you to think about every frame, and there's the time that you have to spend with each image to make those choices that when it plays it feels so ethereal and magical, but I also know that there is the hand of an artist here who created something so well thought out that I think is impossible in other media. So I think there's something so special about being, open to using these medium or this medium. In addition to that, I feel like, sadly in the pandemic when lots of film shoots got shut down, I heard a lot of people say like, oh, maybe I'll just make an animation because it's easy, because I don't need a crew and I don't need to leave my house. And I don't know, I found that a little bit frustrating because I think that it treats animation as if it is like a last resort to filmmaking, but it is like an incredible tool in communicating something that you cannot create with other media. So, I think that's what I'm thinking about.
Can I share a couple things? So in this particular setup, we don't have a screen for you to be able to see our work. However, if you go to the website,
If there's the panel listing, there's a link that you can click there.
there's a link that you can click and see our films, and I think it's just for today.
Only for today.
Only for
yes.
today. And for people who don't know the animation process, basically it's single frame. So if you think about like a still photograph, so it's creating that single moment, but you need, it runs at 24 frames a second. So you need 24 drawings to equal a second, or 12 drawings, 2 frames each, to get to the 24. So it is very laborious.
Yeah, it can also, sometimes it takes people a minute for a month or longer, so it's a very involved process. And speaking on that, how animation, you're creating an entire world, you're creating your own laws of physics, gravity, and visual characteristics that may or may not be relevant or applicable in the real world. So you're creating the entire set, the lighting, the props, the characters. So I'm curious, perhaps we could start with you, Vashti. When you're thinking of like exploring an entire world, like what, how do you start making the multitude of decisions that go into that, and how is that related to your identity, or what are you drawing on when you're creating those worlds?
Yeah, whenever I'm creating work for myself, or if I'm doing visual development for other people for their animated films, it's really it's a similar process to the sort of pre-planning of making a film, but I usually attempt to develop a visual style, to develop a shape language really early on. But if I want to make a shot that is, inside of a used bookstore, I can't just go to a used bookstore and then, use that as my backdrop. I could photograph it, but I'm usually spending extra time to think about each of these individual choices, about how the shape and the size and the composition is going to communicate what is happening in the scene, in the moment. And so for me, I spend a lot of time trying to make creative choices that are always going to push the narrative forward, push the story forward, particularly like a main character's emotion or emotional journey. But there's no like copy paste. There's no, to a degree, but there's no like button that I can press. I have to think about each of these individual choices. If it says, there's a child and we look underneath their bed and there's a ton of toys and stuff, the junk underneath their bed. I have to think about each of those individual things. And I'm not just going to create any random thing. I'm going to think specifically about this character and how these objects are going to communicate something important to them or to the scene. So for me, it is this, it is the time that you have to spend working on a drawing, working on prop design, working on character design or costume design, and each of those choices that we make. I usually tell people they can't be a mistake. You have to be thoughtful about all of those things because you have to create them. So, ideally, I am thinking about all of those things, time permitting.
It's a very intentional process. And I was thinking about your film Hairpiece and also Bend in Oregon, where you're using different collage and you've also gathered a lot of different images. Could you speak a little bit about the research that you do for your films?
Well, it depends on what it is. So, Hairpiece, the research was on the street and growing up in my mother's beauty parlor. For Zajoda and the Boogie Spirit, which is cell animation and early computer animation. In the early 90s, I worked with the first frame-by-frame video camera. And it allowed me to do very interesting things that I couldn't do otherwise. So Zajoda and the Boogie Spirit is the history of African American people told through dance. So that's heavily researched. I think it was about 8 months of research and very traditional research. The Bend in Oregon, which is in the link, so a lot of my ideas come to me in dreams. So for me, animation is a very meditative process. Because you're working single frame, you sort of go, for me, it's almost like getting in a trance. So between dreams and this trance-like state, I am able to call up the things that I need to call up and experiment with them. So I do a lot of animation for pleasure. So Princess Zaya and the Bend in Oregon, no one asked me to do it. It's not in distribution, it's online. I was thinking some things through. It's sci-fi and animation. So it's a way of meditating for me. So I think of it somewhat as a spiritual practice as well.
Thank you. And Iyabo and Charlotte, so you all collaborated on a film together. And I was wondering if you could speak about that collaboration and how you developed a shared vocabulary and vision, or even like color in that piece, is particularly yellow, which you're wearing yellow today. But thinking about that collaboration and how you developed your shared vocabulary.
Okay. Yes, filmmaking to me is very meditative also, and because we were working together and it was an animation, I relied heavily as well on my dreams, because Charlotte was like, what is it about? Like, what's the list? Where's this? And I was like, hold on a second. and I had to actually go within and see what the shots were. And then Charlotte had to do all of that, the labor of bringing all of that thoughtfulness and more to a very vague description of a shot. So I'm also a cinematographer, so and I liken like cinematography to when I'm working for a director, to a process that's very much like midwifing. And in our case, we were sort of midwifing each other because when Charlotte came up with the yellow character drawing, I was like startled and happy, and I wasn't expecting it. All I said was a man at a man making a call at a phone, and so all of that detail, I didn't really understand. It was my perception was in a way because Charlotte had to deliver that for me. It was very paralyzing in some ways because of how much care you were putting into the process because it was also like a shared prayer. So
Yeah, I think there was just like a huge deal of mutual trust in the whole process, and it was really an honor because, I mean, you know, with the characters, the main color of the character and such, so for context, at the time when we start working together on this, I'm very green. I'm basically fresh out of school. And Iyabo comes to me with this crazy idea, and I'm like, yes, let's do it, let's make it. And we talked a lot about, she showed me some pictures of her family, of the people who were part of this story, the archival photos. And we talked a lot about our respective backgrounds and our experiences with processing like loss and grief and people who are no longer there. The yellow color, it was both this strange trick that is for animators, you know, like the entire figure is a solid color. And so it creates these very bold and striking compositions. But also it's deliberately non-human, it's deliberately symbolic, because I think at the time we didn't know where Iyabo's brother was, but our hope is that he's good, he's golden, he's fine. And yellow for us was like that sort of hopeful color, I think.
yeah. And then another thing that Charlotte did was put me in the film because he was describing these ephemeral encounters that he was having with people on the street, bumping into them, and that triggering memories. And so Charlotte took my face, and I was like, that looks like me. And it forced me to make this film more like revealing and being more vulnerable, and not just it being about my brother. So that was the powerful catalyst as well. So it was like constantly going back and forth and like dreaming together. And it was really hard. I'm not gonna lie. And it was the pandemic as well, so it was no face-to-face interaction. It was really challenging, but there were these really beautiful moments of discovery.
Yeah. There were funny moments and there were scary moments. There were like that female character in the film is from an old photo Iyabo showed me of like her, I think you're like in your 20s at that point, and you're wearing this scarf.
Don't tell anyone, I'm still 20.
You're still sorry. We've started talking a little bit about collaboration. Also, I just want to check, can everyone hear okay? Okay, yeah, great, we have these mics. So we're talking about collaboration a little bit, and sometimes collaborating not being physically in the room or in the same city together. So in the case of Ayo, in the case of your film, I know you spoke a little bit about collaboration for music on one of your pieces. Could you talk a little bit about how that process went for you and your collaborator?
So Zajoda and the Boogie Spirit uses cell animation, computer animation, still photographs, and it has a really incredible soundtrack created by Mino Sinalou. And I've always been interested in new technologies. And Mino was in Japan, and there's a section in Zajoda and the Boogie Spirit where our ancestors are being chained, put on the boat, and going through the Middle Passage. And he thought it would be great to have thunderstorms as part of the soundtrack. And he recorded these soundtracks, these robust storms in Japan, and then sent sort of the first digital files. And we built that soundtrack never being in the same room. And so that's what we were able to do with sound before we were actually able to do that with picture. So it is partly my interest in new technology that was inspired by the work of a musician as opposed to another filmmaker or a computer scientist. Yeah.
It's interesting how working with other people brings out new things, especially cross-genre like that.
Well, you know, collaboration, it's so important. Like, I'm an only child, and I consider myself a lone wolf. I'm used to doing a lot of things by myself. And when I finally learned to collaborate, I realized it's about putting the right people on the bus. You can't just collaborate with anybody. You have to collaborate with people where you have some sharing in how you think, how you feel, the aesthetics. You don't have to be in lockstep, and actually it's better if you're not, that you find collaborators who will push you and you will push them, and realize that even though you may disagree sometime, the bottom line, fundamentally, you're both, or you all are trying to get the best version of the story that you can. So I've been very fortunate in that I've had the right people on the bus for a very long time.
And Vashti, you collaborate a lot when you're working on pre-visualization and concept art. I wonder if you could talk about how you frame the drawings that you're presenting to the team you're working with, and also talk a little bit about the collaboration in that pre-visualization process.
In those moments, I'm usually brought on to a project that's usually got a goal in mind, an audience in mind. Either television animation or short films for a commercial audience. And, often I'm thinking about the person who's going to be watching this thing and who I'm going to be connecting with. And often those are children. But I think in the creative process, when it's just me, just developing a character, or just developing a style, I'm usually thinking about the world that this could be. And I try to, be at least a little bit open to experimenting. But, for example, I did character designs for a television show that was very commercial, like very straightforward, and it was based off of like a comic book. And, I tried to keep in mind the spirit of what the comic was and who it was for, while adding in something that felt personal and unique to me. So I think I try to keep all of those things in mind. But, in other cases, like Hair Love, that at the time was a Kickstarter. We were trying to reach lots of people in the hopes that they would donate. So I wanted to create characters that would grab people on the internet. A lot of the work that I create, I post online on social media, and I'm often thinking about how can I grab people's attention. So I had a little bit of that in mind. So, there are different goals in mind for each of the characters that I'm creating or the worlds that I'm building. And so often often the end product is in my mind when I'm starting.
This is going so fast, but I did want to talk a little bit about shape-shifting in animation and in illustration. I think one thing that animation allows you to do is have things talk or move in ways that they don't do in our reality. So thinking about Iyabo and Charlotte, especially the use of birds in the film and silence and visualization, I'm wondering if you could chat a little bit about your decision with shape-shifting and birds and how you use scale.
For sure. With the birds, I definitely would have to mention also somebody who was really important in the execution of this film. Guinness Iona Waller was our lead animator, and also like just has this incredible understanding of the way like movement works across frames and time and rhythm. With the birds, we had a couple different ways we did them. One more naturalistically with hand-drawn animation, and then another with like CG, which forming these large murmurations, these like swarms. And the reason for those murmurations.
Yeah, well, that was also in some of your prior work, and also it connects to like spirituality as well. I see birds as a very feminine, motherly force, and in my dreams with my brother, sometimes I would see birds accompanying him. And even one time when he was assaulted, I found later that he had just been assaulted, but I saw a bird falling from the sky and all of that. So all of those little elements were important because I felt that the birds were an extension of him. So, and in the film, a bird transports him to safety, and it was a big bird. So I'm not sure. Like, all I said to Charlotte was, a bird takes him and puts him in a giant flower, and then Charlotte made the decisions about how big, the color, scale, all of those things, and the pace. So yeah, and Charlotte had him hail down the bird almost. Like, there was a lot of agency that Charlotte put in the character that was not communicated through me. Even when my brother was flying, there was a moment where he stopped and he was suspended. And I kept thinking, like, in live action, let's keep him falling, and then the bird gets him. But I believe that Charlotte thought it was important for him to have awareness in that moment as well.
Yeah, that was like training wheels moment for us. We went back and forth on that shot a lot because he was sort of swimming in the air and like floating around and flying. And then, it just really boils down to like so much trust, so much faith that you put in me and then us, our animation team, to just bring these words and ideas and images to like a visual representation.
And I was thinking about in your film Bend in Oregon, how there's a scarab that watches over Princess Zaya. And I was wondering if you could talk about your use of non-human characters in film or what that brings.
Yeah, so I wanted to actually answer the question that you posed previously.
Okay.
So I come from a dance background. I've spent a long time as a dancer. I grew up with a mother who thought the arts were very important. So I'm already used to controlling the speed of my body consciously, the speed and also the shape of my body. So I bring that to animation very easily. In terms of incorporating non-human elements in the stories, to me it's just all energy. So it doesn't matter if it's a a two-legged human or if it's a scarab. It's really just energy. And sometimes that energy works better in forms that are less familiar in our everyday to help create the world and the magic of the story.
Thank you. And Vashti, I was thinking about, and Hair Lover, you could speak on any work that you would like, how you make use of, well, energy or shape-shifting or hair, or like bringing a character out of something that maybe we don't expect there to be a character.
Yeah, I mean, I think to animate is to breathe life into something. So often when I'm creating characters, I'm thinking about what will it look like to move? What will it feel like to believe that this thing is real? So I'm often trying to like imagine what it could feel like when I'm creating, and then beautiful, talented animators breathe life into the work that I've created. I think it's important to always, imagine. People always ask me like, why do I love drawing characters? Why do I love drawing girls? And why do they feel like unique? And I always say, thank you so much. But to me, I'm imagining that they are real people. And I'm imagining that they have hopes and dreams and there's a real world for them. And so that's, I think, what's the beauty of this tool of animating. So often I'm trying to just imagine what it could be when I do my part of the job and then get to share that with the other people and the team.
Thank you. Well, we are boiling down to our last few minutes, so I want to ask about temporality in animation. As an animation can take place at any time, also blending time moments together. So I'm curious if you would talk about like the time setting of your piece or the pacing and how you decide, or how you like to play with that in your work.
So for the edit, that's where it came in for me, because it was a very meditative piece that had moments of like quiet and stillness and sound. The way that I got into the pacing was through the sound design and playing with field recordings that I made and like imagining how things sounded in the world. And I rely a lot on Trinh Ha that talks a lot about how the image and the temporality and the pacing is married to sound or silence. So that was kind of my entry point into the temporality, is through the edit.
I love Trinh Ha. Her naked spaces is really just extraordinary. So, you know, the thing with that animation, you really, really, really can control time and space in ways that are just extraordinary. So I am from Philadelphia. I went to Catholic school early on, and on Sundays I went to a very large church where at that time the Mass was spoken in Latin. So as kids who did not know Latin, it was a meditative experience. So your mind could just wander all over the place. And this, you know, I mean this lovingly, but the Catholic Church, it's like costume drama for a kid. Everything I know about filmmaking, I learned through Catholic Mass. So there's the lighting. There's chiaroscuro lighting, which you learn about in film school. You know, there's the candle lighting. At Easter time, these massive statues of the Blessed Virgin Mary are wrapped in like the most beautiful purple cloth. But you kind of, as a kid, you kind of drift in and out. So you have these lapses in real time. And in animation, to be able to explore that, you know, every element, as was said earlier, every element is selected. It's selected, it's shaped, color, texture, where it's going to appear on the screen, how long it's going to appear, what it's going to appear next to. It's a lot of control. So it's interesting that within this control of time, I'm actually able to let my spirit loose and to fly. So that's been an interesting process for me, that I've actually learned a lot about myself by working in this single frame, frame by frame medium. And the use of time, being able to play with that, it really kind of plays with your headspace so that you can, drift in and out of any space that you want to be in.
Thank you. I think we have about 30 seconds before we open it up to the audience. So if there's, oh, okay, maybe I'll just open it up to see if you all have questions. And thank you so much for coming. Yeah. Any questions? Or I have plenty more, but any questions from the audience?
So here's a question that you haven't asked that I'd like to answer. Do you have to know how to draw to be an animator? No. So there was a time when, there's all different kinds of animation. Some of it is character-driven, 3D modeling, or, just being able to create the illusion of reality. That's one particular kind of animation. But there's a lot of different styles of animation. And some of my favorite work really exists in the experimental category, where people are not necessarily playing with human figures. There's animation that's just devoted to blocks of color, for example. We've seen that with some of the Canadian animators, for example. And now with a lot of the digital tools, you can pull in various assets, be it photographs that are on your phone that can be animated, or to take images and map them on to other things and then be able to control how those appear. So perhaps a long time ago, animation was thought that you had to know how to draw. You don't necessarily have to know how to draw, but you have to know how to think about space and objects in space.
And it looks like we have a number of questions that will start here, and then.
First, I want to thank everyone. This has been an amazing panel. It's been inspiring. I am so happy I came to this. To speak to something you guys brought up earlier in terms of collaboration and process, I am a narrative short filmmaker, but I have recently been tasked with producing a stop-action, 7-minute animated children's book. I have no idea what I'm doing. I accepted it as a friendship thing, and now I'm labeled a producer. So my question specifically is, how do I acquire a producer with animation experience, particularly stop motion, and build my team? Because we have funding ongoing, and we're doing rather well with that, but I need the nuts and bolts, the grit, to get the process started in terms of the animation, producing those aspects to it. Thank you.
So you're looking for an animation producer?
I think you should learn how to do it. For anyone who wants to do anything in animation but hasn't done it before, know exactly what the process being used to create your project is. Know the shop that the stop action animator is going to go to buy the fabric that they need for the puppet they're going to make. It's like really the most helpful thing to understand the workflow, like top to bottom.
Well, you could look at, there's different resources available and also tutorials, and even just doing a test stop motion at your home after like a little YouTube tutorial, it'll give you a little more insight into the labor that's involved.
So I would suggest looking at animated films that you really like.
Yeah.
And looking at the crew list and see who the producers are. You can also call ITVS and ask them who they funded, the animators that they have funded. And also the National Black Programming Consortium, and ask them who the animators are that they funded. And I have found that if you're interested in animation but you don't necessarily want to do the animation yourself, I think that's absolutely fine. Like, stay in your lane, that's fine. But when you're collaborating with people, you have to at least know their language. So you don't have to know technically how it's done, but you need to be able to use the language and understand how animators think so that you can collaborate successfully with them. So, something even basic like, I want a wide shot. So a wide shot is not the same to everybody. So you have to begin to, be more specific, and particularly when you're talking about time and space, like how you want things to move through the world. So you need to know the language, and it's also a sign of respect.
Yeah. I want to get to a couple more questions if we have time. There was...
Hello. So my question is, are there any techniques that any of you haven't done so far that you're interested in trying out for yourselves or investigating in your next films or pieces that you plan to work on or that you'd like to do for yourselves?
Yes. So right now I'm experimenting a lot with motion capturing. So I have a Rococo motion capturing suit that I use to build avatars. So that's something that I'm experimenting right now with. And also Unreal Engine. I'm at the early stages of teaching that to myself.
Hello. Hi, thank you for this panel. It was really great, and I really enjoyed it. How do you feel about artificial intelligence entering the creative world, and really artificial intelligence and its impact on animation and the process of creating?
Such a good question.
Okay. The conversations that we're having now around AI, these conversations are not new. Whenever there is like a big leap being made in technology, the conversations are still the same. Is it bad? Is it good? And that's unfortunate because I think in our educational system, we're trained to think in very binary ways, that things are either really good or they're really bad. Multiple things can be true at the same time, and that's a harder concept. In the US, we don't teach that well in education. So people talk about AI as though we are not the creators of it. It's like this magical force that came out of nowhere, and suddenly it's wreaking havoc. Like technology, we created the technology, so the question is what we're going to do with it. And I think we have to be careful not to engage in conversations that create false arguments.
Thank you. Maybe one last question, because we have one last minute.
Hi. Oh, hi. I am a digital illustrator, and I'm trying to get more into animation. Also, I came here late, so I'm not sure if this was answered before, but what would be the advice? Like right now, my mind is thinking about going to grad school, but I'm learning more about the animation process and how more vast it is. What advice would you give to your younger self if you were going into the animation world?
I'd start sooner. I learned a lot on the internet, so I would just start making something sooner, and because as you're making, you'll ask yourself a lot of questions and you'll be able to like look into things that you need to learn more about. But
It was very helpful for me to do one animation and draw it frame by frame, because then I understood a little bit about the process. But it's also really evolving past that. There's so many different ways that you can approach animation. So I would just research some of the ways and see which one feels, or which ways, multiple ways feel resonant with you, or you feel drawn to.
I started drawing after I finished graduate school. I went to school for experimental film and rekindled a love for drawing after that. And so I just had my own drive to force me. And I think something I always tell artists, the only way to be a better illustrator is to draw. The only way to be a better writer is to write and read. And you know, every once in a while I think, oh man, I wish I had those years of the fundamentals of color theory and perspective, but there's nothing that I can't teach myself through the practice of art making. And so every once in a while, I'll take another course. I'll watch another Skillshare class. I'll watch another Domestika course. I just took a background painting course on animation. But you know, I don't feel like you have to go through, you know, higher education to do that. But I think there is so much you learn through the practice of making. So. Working on other people's films or animations. I worked briefly in the animation industry as a production coordinator, not doing anything art related, but I learned so much about the pipeline. I learned so much about what it means to create a character that is going to be animated, what the animators are going to hate that comes from the character designers, what the background designers, what the animators are really not going to appreciate coming from storyboards. So, I mean, there are ways you can PA on different shows, or even just work on other people's work, that I think there's a way to educate yourself in it without, you know, going to school and getting into debt like me.
So I think
That is real.
That is very real. Unfortunately, this is on this timeline. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you to the wonderful panelists.
Thank you too.